Shadows in the Mansion. Secrets. Part 2. Obasi lowered his voice so Nasha wouldn't hear him. "We'll talk later, Karen. Please help keep things in order until I get back." He then quickly disconnected the call. As he did, Nasha called again, her delicate voice filled with concern and uncertainty. With a sharp, purposeful turn, Obasi shifted his large frame, settling flat on his back once again. He glanced toward Kahinda, giving a subtle nod. Understanding the signal, Kahinda moved to the door, opening it just enough for Nasha to peer inside but not step through. In a soothing tone, Kahinda reassured Nasha that she was nearly finished treating him and that Obasi would be fine. As she gently closed the door, her gaze lingered on Nasha, who looked up at her with wide, startled eyes. When the door clicked shut, Kahinda paused, taking a moment to absorb the weight of the encounter. There was no denying it. Nasha was strikingly beautiful. Concern tugged at her thoughts. She couldn't help but notice the vast difference between the two souls now locked together inside the mansion. Obasi, towering and formidable even in his injured state, was a man of undeniable strength and presence. And Nasha, she was so small, so fragile, with the delicate way her dreadlocks framed her soft features and her narrow shoulders, making her seem as though she could shatter under the weight of any sudden movement. While Nasha had looked up at her with those wide, hazel eyes, filled with both curiosity and uncertainty, it made Kahinda feel a protectiveness she hadn't anticipated. She had found herself closing the door slowly, cautiously, as though even the faintest brush of it might harm her. A quiet tension gripped her as she glanced back at Obasi, with thoughts of Nasha. The two of them, trapped together. It felt like a delicate balance was about to be tested. And it was Nasha's fragility that worried her most. Would she come to regret agreeing to keep Obasi's secret if he couldn't resist Nasha's unwitting allure? She turned back to Obasi, who had sat up once more, his posture firm, though his gaze remained distant, fixed on the door, clearly consumed by thoughts of Nasha. This was so unlike him. Obasi, the tireless workaholic known for his meticulousness, had just entrusted his beloved museum to someone else. He had rushed back to Nigeria on impulse, well ahead of his usual schedule, and it wasn't even halfway through the year. Without hesitation, he had thrown himself into danger, risking his life in the process. First, he had been severely injured, and then, in a startling act of recklessness, had thrown himself down the stairs feigning illness. Obasi, who had always been so careful and controlled, had become unpredictable. And all for the girl standing just beyond the door. A girl whose name he hadn't even known until last night, and of whom he still knew almost nothing. She stepped closer to him, ready to voice the assessment she had made since day one. "You're in love with her, aren't you?" Kahinda watched him carefully, her gaze sharp. She had known Obasi long enough to see the tension simmering just below the surface, even in his silence. He had confessed just moments ago, his voice low and rough, that he wanted Nasha. The words had come out with a force that had startled her. But now, faced with the quiet that followed, something still didn't sit right. "You're in love with her, aren't you, Obasi?" she asked again, her voice steady, cutting through the silence like a blade. Obasi remained still, his eyes fixed on the floor for a long moment, before shifting back to the door. His posture, rigid as ever, didn't betray much, but Kahinda could feel the weight of the question pressing on him. "It's not that simple," he muttered finally, his voice restrained, as if he were trying to keep something buried. Kahinda raised an eyebrow, stepping forward slowly. "You told me you want her. You've crossed an ocean for her, Obasi. You risked your life. We're nearly sliced in half. How can you say it's not love?" His eyes flickered, and though he didn't look directly at her, she could see the conflict tightening in his jaw. "Wanting her isn't the same as love," he said, his tone deliberate, measured. He shifted slightly, as though the words themselves pained him to admit. Why? She pressed, her voice softening just enough to coax him. Why is it so hard for you to call it love? Obasi's gaze stayed on the door, as though he could avoid the answer by simply not meeting her eyes. Because love, it's not what I think this is. He paused, taking a slow breath. I want to help her, to protect her. It feels like the right thing. But love? His voice trailed off, the word feeling dangerous on his lips. The silence between them grew heavier. When he spoke again, it was barely above a whisper. Love makes you blind. It makes you weak. I've seen what it does. I felt it. I don't want that again. Kahinda's eyes softened, but she didn't move closer. She knew Obasi too well to push him when he was already retreating into himself. You loved Karen, she said gently, acknowledging the wound she knew was still raw beneath the surface. I did, Obasi said, his voice taut with the memory. Desperately. And where did it leave me? Broken. She hesitated, watching him closely. She still works for your company. Why? She's good at her job, he replied briefly. Kahinda shook her head. No. It's because you're too kind-hearted. After everything she's done? I don't buy that, Obasi. She searched his eyes, but he didn't respond. I've never said this before, but don't you think there's a reason she's still clinging to you? Karen never loved you the way you deserved, and you know it. Obasi flinched, his silence a heavy confirmation of what she already knew. If you love Nasha... This, Obasi interrupted, his voice rougher now. With Nasha, it's different, he said, shaking his head as if to convince himself. I want her close, but I don't know if it's love. I can't let it be. Kahinda studied him in silence. He was not a man prone to outbursts of emotion, and even this guarded admission was more than she expected. She could see the conflict in the tightness of his shoulders, the way he kept his words measured, never allowing himself to tip too far into vulnerability. You think you can keep it under control? She said quietly, watching his face. You can't. Obasi exhaled, a long and weary breath. I've lost the capacity to love. Kahinda paused. She knew Obasi well enough to understand that when he was in this state, there was no convincing him otherwise. But she also knew the truth, even if he couldn't see it yet. Love doesn't work like that, she said softly. It's already happening, whether you admit it or not. Enough, Obasi said abruptly, his deep voice firm, cutting through the lingering tension in the room. Kahinda didn't flinch. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but a hint of amusement flickered behind them. I'm not one of your employees, Obasi, she replied calmly, crossing her arms. You can't just order me into submission. I won't respond to your commands like they do. He exhaled, his gaze shifting away from her as he clenched his jaw, but the words didn't come. She stepped closer, her tone softening but staying resolute. You know I'm right. Whether you admit it or not, you know. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken thoughts, but Kahinda wasn't fazed. Now, lie down so I can treat your wound, she instructed, her voice firm but calm. Obasi hesitated only a second before complying. He lay back down, wincing slightly as the movement tugged at his injury. Kahinda moved efficiently, her hands quick and careful, as she began tending to the wound once again. As she worked, Obasi remained silent, his eyes locked on her face, seeming to watch her with an intensity that suggested his mind was elsewhere, far beyond the sting of the needle or the tension of the moment. After a long stretch of silence, he muttered, After all these years, You'd think you'd be a lot less stubborn. Kahinda paused just long enough to smirk, not lifting her gaze from her task. I could say the same for you, she replied. For a moment, the corners of Obasi's lips twitched, an almost smile breaking through the cracks of his stern expression. But before the moment could settle, the needle pierced his skin, and the pain tore through his brief flicker of amusement. He grimaced, his jaw tightening as Kahinda continued her work, her smirk lingering as she glanced down at him. You'll live, she remarked, her voice light but knowing. But are you sure you can bear the pain without aid tonight? Obasi's voice held its usual steady confidence. I'm an Igbo man, Kahinda. What pain, he said, and then without warning, he winked. It was such an uncharacteristic move for him that it caught her off guard. Her reaction was immediate, a rush of warmth mingling with surprise at this rare glimpse of his lighter side, and she found herself smiling, unable to help it. After a few minutes of complete silence in the room as Kahinda worked, she sighed, her gaze drifting to the locked door. All right, Obasi, I'm done here. This has to be the strangest situation you've ever dragged me into. But listen, you need to be careful. Her tone shifted, growing more serious. I suspect you already know this, but as your friend I'll say it anyway. The longer you keep this secret, the worse it'll be when it comes out. And it will come out, especially if you're serious about Nasha. She paused, watching him closely. Tell her, tonight or tomorrow. If she finds out on her own, it won't go over well. It's only been one chaotic night, so you can probably be forgiven for not saying anything yet. But if you want her trust, you have to start on the right foot. Obasi nodded, his voice low. I know. And in the meantime, for God's sake, don't overact, Kahinda added with a smirk. Obasi's brows furrowed slightly. What do you mean? Kahinda scoffed. The groaning, Obasi. Understanding flickered in his eyes, and he gave a slow, resigned nod, the faintest twitch of his lips showing he understood her point. As she moved toward the door, she glanced back with a playful smile. By the way, if this one breaks your heart, well, you know where to find me. She winked before stepping out. Nasha shifted her weight restlessly from foot to foot, her arms wound tightly around herself, as though by sheer force she could contain the turmoil roiling inside. The faint, muffled tones of Kahinda's voice drifted through the heavy door, distant and indistinct. She strained, desperate to catch some sound, anything that might signal Obasi's response. But there was nothing. No reassuring baritone, no murmured reply. Only silence. They had been locked inside for so long. An icy knot twisted within her, coiling tighter with each passing second, dread blooming slowly, inexorably. He's not responding. The thought gnawed at her, sending ripples of panic through her already frayed nerves. What if he's too weak to speak? Her mind spiraled further. What if the pain is so excruciating that he can't even form words? Her breath hitched, chest tightening as the image of Obasi, motionless, broken, flooded her mind. It was unbearable, the weight of guilt pressing down on her with suffocating force. This is all my fault. Her heart pounded furiously, her thoughts cascading into regret. I should never have come here. I should never have picked that lock. Trouble always followed her like a shadow, dark and unyielding, clinging to her no matter how fast or far she ran. It seemed every step she took, every place she found refuge in, became tainted, ruined by her mere presence. How could I have thought I'd find safety here? Of course things went wrong. They always do. The silence behind the door grew louder, the absence of sound a crushing weight. A lump swelled in her throat, thick and suffocating. Perhaps the best thing she could do now was leave. Maybe if I go now, I can stop more harm from coming. Stop dragging people into my mess. Her feet shuffled, instinct urging her to flee. But just as her body began to obey, she froze. No, leaving now would be cruel. How could she abandon him when he lay injured because of her? It was her fault. All her fault. She couldn't turn her back on him, not when he had been hurt trying to protect her. But I never should have come here in the first place. She pressed her hand to her temple, closing her eyes against the flood of memories. That night, the night she had fled, came rushing back, sharp and vivid. The terror of running through the darkness, knowing the men were closing in on her. She had been so desperate, stumbling through the streets until she'd found herself in front of the mansion. She remembered how she had practically thrown herself into the garden, diving into the flower bed as though the earth could swallow her whole. The rough stems had scratched at her skin as she hid among the blooms, trembling as the car passed by slowly, its headlights sweeping over the street. They hadn't found her, but the fear had been paralyzing, rooting her there for hours, too terrified to move. When she had finally stirred from her uneasy slumber among the flowers, they were still out there, circling like vultures. She had no choice but to pick the lock and slip inside. I just needed a place to hide, she reminded herself, but the guilt gnawed relentlessly at her. Once inside, the mansion had felt like a fortress, silent, impenetrable, safe. She hadn't meant to stay long, just long enough for the men to move on. But the walls had lulled her into a false sense of security, and so she had stayed. And then, she had done the unthinkable. She had come back. Stupid, so stupid, she whispered. She should have known better. She did know better. Returning to the same place twice was reckless, a mistake she never made. The men hunting her always found her when she lingered. They had eyes and ears everywhere, an unseen network that followed her every move, leaving no one to trust. Yet she had ignored her instincts, and now this man, Obasi, was paying the price for her carelessness. Her thoughts shifted to the man who had attacked her inside the mansion, when she had foolishly left the door unlocked. Who was he? Could he be connected to those searching for her? There seemed to be no other explanation, and if that were true, he would come back, maybe with reinforcements, maybe tonight. Oh God! The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. I can't stay. I have to leave. But how? Her eyes darted to the window, the night pressing in like an ominous shroud. Kahinda's voice was still muffled, too faint to discern, but there was hope. Nasha's gaze flickered to the car parked outside. Kahinda had driven. Maybe if she could convince the nurse to take Obasi to the hospital, she could slip away unnoticed, leaving the mansion exactly as she had found it. But how do I ask without raising suspicion? She wondered, her mind spinning. Kahinda's sharp eyes had unnerved her from the beginning, as though she could see right through her. So far, the nurse had asked no probing questions, but her silence had felt heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts. By now she must be wondering why I keep letting her in through the back door. Maybe she knows that I can't open the front one, knows that I shouldn't be here. Nasha's fingers trembled as her thoughts whirled. The quiet behind the door now felt suffocating, like a noose tightening around her throat. She could hear nothing, not Kahinda, not Obasi. The stillness gnawed at her, sending a fresh wave of panic surging through her chest. What if something's happened? What if Obasi's condition had worsened? What if he was gone? Her breath hitched as dread gripped her, and without thinking, she moved toward the door. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she raised her fist, hesitated, then knocked softly. The sound barely carried, so she knocked again, harder this time. Obasi? Her voice was small, barely more than a whisper, yet it trembled with fear as she waited, the silence behind the door growing heavier with every passing second.